In this lecture, we'll leave the 18th century for the 19th, focusing our attention on Sir Walter Scott. Scott's dates are 1771 to 1832. After reviewing the events of Scott's life, and we'll want to pay particular attention to his decision to write fiction, which was a kind of momentous decision for him. After we review the biography, we'll consider his enormous contribution to the development of the historical novel. Though it's not quite so highly esteemed today, the historical novel enjoyed enormous prestige through much of the 19th century. Our main focus will be on the first of Scott's historical novels, Waverley, which he published anonymously in 1814. As we consider this work, we'll need to review the historical events and themes treated in it, paying close attention to the Jacobite uprisings of the 18th century. Moving on to biographical matters then, we might note that Scott is a Scot. He was born in Edinburgh, and he died at Abbotsford, his county home near the River Tweed. Scott came from a family of professionals. His father was an attorney, and his maternal grandfather a professor of physiology. Thus, Scott was connected to an intellectual movement now known as the Scottish Enlightenment. The movement was active from the end of the 17th century to the beginning of the 19th century. Figures associated with it include philosopher David Hume and economist Adam Smith. Ideas associated with this movement would prove important to Scott's later fiction. Especially important, as we'll soon see, was a vision of historical progress. It's said that Scott's storytelling abilities were honed on the playground, where he told tales to amuse his schoolmates. He studied at the University of Edinburgh and was admitted to the bar in 1792. His earliest achievements in literature came as a collector of traditional Scottish ballads. His 3-volume collection of these ballads, titled Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border, was published in 1802 and 1803. Scott's collection was one of several such works produced in this period. Indeed, scholars now see the revival of interest in the traditional ballad as an important component of the larger Romantic movement. Scott was not only a collector and editor, however, and he would soon distinguish himself as a poet in his own right, achieving great success with such works as The Lay of the Last Minstrel from 1805 and The Lady of the Lake from 1810. Scott's own poetry was so successful that in 1813 he was offered the position of poet laureate. He turned it down, suggesting that the post go to Robert Southey instead. He seems to have begun experimenting with fiction, trying out some sketches and playing around with characters as early as 1805. He finished the first 7 chapters of what would later become Waverley and then shared that material with a friend. The friend's response was lukewarm, not negative, but not really positive either, and so Scott was discouraged. A few years later, he sought a second opinion, but was again disappointed. According to his own account of these events, he slipped the manuscript into a drawer and forgot all about it until he discovered it one day when looking for some fishing tackle. Scholars now suspect that his motives for turning to fiction were more complicated than he let on. Indeed, scholars believe that Scott's decision was prompted by a reluctance to compete directly with Lord Byron, whose poems were taking the literary world by storm. Compared with the work that Byron was producing, the ballads that Scott had discovered and was writing seemed a little old-fashioned, not really so sophisticated. Whatever the truth of this matter may be, one thing is certain. Waverley sent Scott down an entirely new path. Between its publication in 1814 and his death in 1832, he published 23 other works of fiction, including Old Mortality in 1816, Rob Roy in 1817, The Heart of Midlothian from 1818, and Ivanhoe in 1819. Scott's later years were anxious. He spent much of that time writing furiously. He's supposed to have produced 60 pages a day in an attempt to pay off massive debts. He was a partner in a publishing company that had to declare bankruptcy, and he worked to pay off a total debt of over £100,000. He was made a baronet in 1820, and that's where the Sir in Sir Walter Scott comes from. And he died after suffering a series of strokes at the age of 61. Scott did not invent the form of the historical novel, as he was quick to admit, but he is its greatest and most famous practitioner. In Scott's hands, the historical novel is a kind of cultural repository, a storehouse in which the manners and customs of vanishing societies can be preserved. Scott pays careful attention to dialects, costumes, and other details, supplementing his stories with historical notes on a variety of topics. And if you get a paperback edition of Waverly, even today, you'll find in the back notes on the way people speak, the way people dress, what people eat, that kind of thing. And the presence of those notes is one of the things that leads scholars to identify Scott's historical fiction as a kind of precedent for modern anthropology, modern ethnography. The result of Scott's efforts is a highly effective recreation of the past, one that engages the reader both intellectually and emotionally. Because of his evident seriousness of purpose, Scott helped to elevate the status of the novel in England. And this point is very, very important. Scott comes along about 75 years after Richardson and Fielding, arriving on the scene at a time when the novel form is still widely regarded as disreputable and dangerous. And Scott tried to address this situation in two ways. First, unlike Frances Burney or Anne Radcliffe, he focused on the adventures of young men. And second, he placed those young men, he placed his heroes in the midst of momentous political events. In so doing, he produced a body of work with enormous appeal for male readers. Then, as now, there were questions about how to get men and boys interested in reading, and Scott seemed to have answered those questions. Now, there was at that time, and probably still is today as well, a widespread assumption that subjects appealing to men are somehow intrinsically more interesting, serious, and important than subjects appealing to women. Consider, if you'd like a contemporary example, the differences between the media's attention to sports on the one hand and its attention to, let's say, fashion on the other. Through the early decades of the 19th century, though other sorts of fiction would become popular, the historical novel remained the most prestigious of all forms. Over the course of the 19th century, almost every major English novelist would try her or his hand at the historical novel. Even works not explicitly designed as historical novels, such as Vanity Fair or Middlemarch, were often set in the recent past as a way of giving those stories extra weight or significance. Scott's influence was felt around the world, inspiring the historical fiction of James Fenimore Cooper in the United States, Victor Hugo in France, and Leo Tolstoy in Russia. War and Peace is a novel influenced by Scott. In considering Scott's contributions to the development of the English tradition, we should recognize the power of his writing and the depth of his historical reflections. Scott is drawn to societies in transition, focusing most often on conflicts between traditional ways of life and new social orders. In Ivanhoe, for example, he takes us back to the Middle Ages, exploring the conflict between the Saxons and Normans. In Kenilworth, published in 1821, the setting is Elizabethan England, and the subject the various intrigues surrounding the Queen. In this novel, incidentally, both Shakespeare and Sir Walter Raleigh appear as characters. Though Scott is writing about the past, it's clear that he's thinking about the present as well. Indeed, through his depictions of past conflicts, Scott raises many of the most pressing questions of his day. And those would include, how do societies grow and change? Is change always positive? What's lost and what's gained as a result of such changes? What are our obligations to the past, and what are our duties to the future? These questions had special significance for readers living through the convulsions of the Industrial Revolution of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. For these readers, the costs and benefits of industrialization and modernization remained unclear. On the one hand, the Industrial Revolution was clearly generating new wealth, opening up new opportunities for many people. On the other hand, it was also widening the gap between rich and poor. In the process, it sometimes seemed to be tearing the whole social fabric in two. People whose ancestors had lived in the same place for centuries were suddenly forced to pull up stakes and try to find work in the city. Now, Scott's readers knew that they couldn't stop the clock, much less turn it back, but they were often disturbed by the frantic pace of social change. In his novels, and more particularly in his approach to history, those readers found a way of honoring the past and a means of reconciling themselves to the future. Honoring the past, reconciling themselves to the future. A perfect example of Scott's complex approach to history can be found in Waverley, a novel centered on the Jacobite uprising of 1745. Before we can really examine the novel, we'll need some understanding of the 45 itself. Let's start by remembering that the 45 was a turning point in the history of both England and Scotland. At issue was the claim of the exiled Stuart family to the throne of England. The Stuarts ruled Scotland from the 1370s and England from the accession of James I in 1603. Their rule ended abruptly in 1649 with the execution of Charles I, but they were restored to the throne in 1660. They remained highly controversial, however, and by 1688 they had been pushed out again. The deposed monarch, James II, eventually fled to France, and it's the claims of his line that the Jacobites are pushing, that they're agitating for. The Jacobites' allegiance to James is indicated by the very term Jacobite, which is derived from the Latin form of his name. Jacobite resentments were constantly simmering. People were never satisfied, especially in Scotland from the 1680s to the 1740s. Sometimes they boiled over, as in the Jacobite uprisings of 1715 and 1745. In the 45, the Jacobites were led by Charles Edward Stuart, grandson and heir to James, who had come over to Scotland from France. Under the leadership of Charles Stuart, later known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, the Jacobites enjoyed early success, eventually taking control of Edinburgh and assembling a considerable army. 5,000 men fought on the Jacobite side at Culloden. Now, unfortunately for the Jacobites, 9,000 were there to fight on the other side. And this defeat was decisive, crushing the hopes of a Stuart restoration. The Jacobites had had their best chance, they'd taken their best shot, and they'd failed. They'd fallen short. More importantly, the defeat of the Jacobites in the 45 signaled the beginning of the more complete integration of Scotland and England into the new political entity of Great Britain. Now, technically, that integration had already been achieved with an official act of political union in 1707. The term Great Britain first came into use at this time as a way of distinguishing this new political entity from the earlier ones. Effectively and practically, there were still tensions between the two nations. The state churches were not merged by the Act of Union, for example, with Presbyterianism remaining the official or established Scottish faith. After the defeat of the Jacobites at Culloden, it became clear that the Scottish could not hold out against political and even cultural unification with England. The English had a bigger army, they were simply richer and stronger. So whether the Scots liked it or not, and many of them didn't, they were going to be absorbed into this new entity called Great Britain and, inevitably, forced to assume a permanent subordination to the English. In thinking about the consequences of the 45, readers of Waverley are guided by the experiences of the novel's impressionable hero, Edward Waverley. So let's talk about the novel for a while. We've considered the historical backgrounds. Let's look at the work itself. Though an officer in the English army, Waverley is attracted to both the land and people of Scotland. As readers, we share his fascination with them both, not least because of the Scottish Highlanders' devotion to traditional ways of life and their close connection to nature. Consider, for example, this relatively early passage in which Waverley follows the sister of a Highland chieftain, her name is Flora, to a beautiful and secluded spot. The passage begins with a speech by Flora herself, and it ends with a description of her effect on Waverley. The narrator tells us, starting with a speech, as I said, by Flora, "I have given you the trouble of walking to this spot, Captain Waverley, both because I thought the scenery would interest you, and because a Highland song would suffer still more from my imperfect translation, were I to introduce it without its own wild and appropriate accompaniments." So you've got to be out in nature to hear this song, to really appreciate this music. "To speak in the poetical language of my country," she says, "the seat of the Celtic muse is in the mist of the secret and solitary hill, and her voice in the murmur of the mountain stream. He who woos her must love the barren rock more than the fertile valley, and the solitude of the desert better than the festivity of the hall." Now please notice here Flora's emphasis on wildness, roughness, and barrenness. These qualities may seem to suggest a kind of primitiveness, but they are the ones that make Scotland such a refreshing alternative to England. Note, too, Flora's emphasis on the close connection between Scottish song and an almost reverential attitude toward nature. As I said before, you can't love or even understand Scottish music if you don't also love the Scottish landscape. As the narrator describes the effect of Flora's song on Waverley, we immediately understand his infatuation with the music, the singer, and with Scotland itself. Few could have heard this lovely woman make this declaration, the narrator says, with a voice where harmony was exalted by pathos, without exclaiming that the muse whom she invoked could never find a more appropriate representative. But Waverley, though the thought rushed on his mind, found no courage to utter it. Indeed, the wild feeling of romantic delight with which he heard the first few notes she drew from her instrument amounted almost to a sense of pain. He would not for worlds have quitted this place by her side, yet he almost longed for solitude, that he might decipher and examine at leisure the complication of emotions which now agitated his bosom. Poor Waverley is smitten, and who can blame him? Gorgeous woman, gorgeous place, gorgeous song. It's a very powerful combination. We understand then when Waverley is drawn into battle on the Jacobite side. The turning point is his encounter with Charles Edward Stuart, with Bonnie Prince Charlie, who actually appears as a character in the novel. In considering the passage in which Waverley is introduced to Bonnie Prince Charlie, we need to understand a couple of things. First, Waverley is being actively recruited by the Scottish rebels, who see him as a valuable asset. Second, Waverley is susceptible to such appeals. He's actually a kind of Don Quixote figure, whose early reading of heroic tales has filled his head with dreams of adventure. And besides, he's falling hard for Flora. In this scene, the prince speaks first, flattering Waverley by saying, "No master of ceremonies is necessary to present a Waverley to a Stuart." It's as if their families are of equal rank and status here, as if they're already operating and behaving as colleagues. Waverley and the prince go on to exchange compliments, and the prince soon mentions Waverley's uncle, who is famous for his undying devotion to the Stuart cause. Listen to what happens next. Unaccustomed to the address and manners of a polished court, in which Charles was eminently skillful, his words and his kindness penetrated the heart of our hero and easily outweighed all prudential motives. To be thus personally solicited for assistance by a prince whose form and manners, as well as the spirit which he displayed in this singular enterprise, that is the rebellion, answered Waverley's ideas of a hero of romance. To be courted by him in the ancient halls of his paternal palace, recovered by the sword which he was already bending towards other conquests, gave Waverley, in his own eyes, the dignity and importance which he had ceased to consider as his attributes. And as that passage rolls on, Scott's narrator helps us to sense Waverley's growing excitement. He gives us a sense of what it would be like to be on the receiving end of this appeal. Narrator also shows us that the prince appeals to Waverley's sense of self-worth. He wants Waverley to feel that in joining his cause, he'll be realizing his own potential. Now, as we'll see when we close out the passage, all of this works like a charm on poor Waverley. He was irresistibly attracted to the cause, which the prejudices of his education and the political principles of his family had already recommended as the most just, the narrator tells us. These thoughts rushed through his mind like a torrent, sweeping before them every consideration of an opposite tendency. The time, besides, admitted no deliberation, and Waverley, kneeling to Charles Edward, devoted his heart and sword to the vindication of his rights. So right there, Waverley is swept up in the emotion of the moment, and he kneels down before the young pretender, before Bonnie Prince Charlie, and says, "Yes, I'll fight with you." Now, even at this early stage, we can sense that there's something, not quite right about this. The flip side of the Highlanders' extreme devotion to the Jacobite cause is, their extreme devotion to the cause. As the story goes on, the Highlanders begin to seem more and more like zealots, and the ones who aren't zealous seem to be mere opportunists, which might be even worse. Waverley eventually realizes his mistakes and regrets his hasty alliance with the Jacobites, whom he comes to see as dangerous and dishonest. On the eve of an important battle, as Waverley prepares to join the Highlanders in fighting against his former regiment, he realizes the gravity of what he's about to do. Waverley could plainly recognize the standard of the troop he had formerly commanded, the narrator explains, and hear the trumpets and kettle drums sound the signal of advance which he had so often obeyed. He could hear, too, the well-known word given in the English dialect by the equally well-distinguished voice of the commanding officer, for whom he had once felt so much respect. It was at that instant, then, that, looking around him, he saw the wild dress and appearance of his Highland associates, heard their whispers in an uncouth and unknown language, looked upon his dress so unlike that which he had worn from his infancy, and wished to awake from what seemed at the moment a dream, strange, horrible, and unnatural. "Good God," he muttered, "am I then a traitor to my country, a renegade to my standard, and a foe to my native England?" And in this passage, the narrator again tries to connect us to Waverley and to get us to share Waverley's confusion. On the one side, the image, the sounds of the Highlanders. On the other side, the image, the sounds of the English troops, and he has only recently left that group. How would he feel? What can he do now? Waverley continues to fight with the Highlanders, but their spell has been broken, and he recognizes that the followers of Charles Stuart, though united against England, are also divided against each other, and therefore unfit to rule a great modern nation. Along with this recognition comes real self-understanding, for Waverley realizes, as the narrator puts it, that his psychological disposition, notwithstanding his dreams of tented fields and military honor, is exclusively domestic. Things do end happily for Waverley. After being pardoned for his flirtation with treason, he inherits a fortune, marries another Scottish woman, and settles down with her in the village of Tully Veolan. Thus, Scott, like Fielding and Richardson before him, provides us with a classic comedic ending. Virtue is rewarded. Waverley's not a bad person, he's just confused, and vice punished. Sympathetic characters, like Waverley, achieve personal fulfillment, and more importantly, an entire society is reintegrated and restabilized, restored to something more like sanity. Waverley's later realizations about the Highlanders do not cancel out their initial appeal, however, and our most powerful memories of the book may well be of the chapters in which Waverley enters into their romantic world. As this account of the novel may suggest, Scott's view of historical change is many-sided. In the defeat of the Stuarts and the Highlanders at Culloden, the defeat of the Jacobites, Scott explains, much was gained, including the spread of peace, tolerance, and a commitment to the use of reason. Yet although the gains outweigh the losses, Scott refuses to pretend that the losses are insignificant. He acknowledges that the life of a modern man like Waverley will never be as exciting or as intense as the life of a Highland chieftain. Here's how Scott's narrator sums it all up at the end of the novel. There is no European nation which, within the course of half a century or little more, has undergone so complete a change as this kingdom of Scotland. Let's just stop there and consider that sentence for a moment. Great changes throughout England, throughout Europe, throughout the world, but nowhere any more dramatic changes than in Scotland. English readers especially need to understand that. They have a tendency to view the Scots in a kind of prejudiced way, and they need to understand that the Scots have been reeling from all of these historical changes. The narrator goes on to say, such of the present generation as can recollect the last 20 or 25 years of the 18th century will be fully sensible of the truth of this statement, especially if their acquaintance and connections lay among those who in my younger time were facetiously called folks of the old leaven, who still cherished a lingering, though hopeless, attachment to the House of Stuart. And here I might just pause and let you know that Scott knew these people. He knew veterans of the 45, had talked with them as a child, and drew on those conversations when writing Waverley. This race, the narrator says, has now almost entirely vanished from the land, and with it, doubtless, much absurd political prejudice, but also many living examples of singular and disinterested attachment to the principles of loyalty which they received from their fathers, and of old Scottish faith, hospitality, worth, and honor. In that passage, and more generally then, Scott's fiction satisfies our need for a pragmatic acceptance of the present and future without denying our keen interest in the glories of the past. It is for this reason, as much as any other, that he exerted such a powerful influence on the readers of his day. Waverley was an immediate and enormous success with the public. The first edition of 1,000 copies sold out in 2 days. The work was no less popular with reviewers. It casts the whole tribe of ordinary novels in the shade, wrote one critic. Perhaps the most amusing response to Waverley came from Jane Austen, who wrote about the novel in a letter to a friend. Walter Scott has no business to write novels, especially good ones, she said. It is not fair. He has fame and profit enough as a poet and should not be taking the bread out of other people's mouths. I do not like him, she concluded, and I do not mean to love Waverley if I can help it, but fear I must. In our next lecture, we'll turn our attention to Austen's own work, focusing on her most enduringly popular novel, Pride and Prejudice.